The theme of this session is constructing effective counter-narratives. To chair this session, may I request Lieutenant General K. Himalaya Singh to join us on the dais. Lieutenant General K. Himalaya Singh, PVSM, UYSM, AVSM, YSM, is a former Lieutenant General of the Indian Army. He is currently the Chairman of Manipur Public Service Commission. Welcome, sir. May I now request first speaker of this session, Dr. Aap Maheshwari, to join us on the dais. Dr. Maheshwari is the Director General of Bureau of Police Research and Development in the Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India. May I now request second speaker of this session, Mr. Nalin Prabhat, to join us on the dais. Mr. Nalin Prabhat is an IPS officer of Andhra Pradesh cadre. He is presently posted as a Special ADG Operations and Greyhounds. He has been decorated with the Police Medal for Gallantry, a Parakram Padak, President's Police Medal for Distinguished Service, and Police Medal for Meritorious Service, besides other decorations. May I now request third speaker of this session, Mr. Shafkat Munir, to join us on the dais. Mr. Shafkat Munir is currently a research fellow at the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies. Prior to this, he has worked as a senior analyst with RSIS at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. May I now request the fourth speaker of this session, Mr. M. Ashraf Hadri. Mr. Hadri is the Director General of Policy and Strategy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Government of Afghanistan. From 2012 to 2015, he has served as Afghanistan's Deputy Chief of Mission to India. He also contributes articles for Washington Post. Welcome all. I now request Lieutenant General K. Himalaya Singh, the chair of this session, to take over the proceedings of this session. Over to you, sir.
Good evening, everybody. Jai Hind. As the sun goes down, I think the attendance appears to be going down. But the good part is, I think most of the subject that we were to discuss has been covered in a large manner in the last session and also the session before that. The other good part is also that we have amongst us the practitioners of all the theories that we discussed yesterday and today. So we hope that the session will be as interesting as the preceding ones. India have had a very long history of counter-terrorist and counter-insurgency campaigns. The kinetic aspect of the campaigns have been largely successful. In fact, in most of the cases, it has been successful. However, the counter-narrative that we are going to discuss today, constructing the counter-narrative, appears to have lagged behind, and we are now trying to catch up with the counter-narrative to the global terrorism. That is the subject of our discussion. Coming to the global aspect, in my view, just to introduce the subject, in the military terms, putting it straight and straightforward, the story being told in the global terror narrative is that there is an epic battle between the truth, between the good and the evil. I mean, that is as simple as that, as being told to the people who want to follow the path of terrorism. And West is inimical to Islam. And it is the duty to fight for Islam, to save Islam. And this is the story being told. And how is it being countered in the world over has been discussed yesterday and today as well. And as far as India is concerned, our counter-narratives have worked in the, whether it exists or not, that we'll discuss later. But the fact is that none of the elements have gone into so-called ISIS or Daesh. None of the Indian citizens so far, those 20 are yet to be confirmed as per the experts' view. So therefore, countering narrative also has got some challenges, such as that you are addressing too many for very few targets. So that is one challenge that I'm sure that we shall be, the distinguished panelists will be able to clarify. And counter-narrative as a strategic option, strategic component of the counterterrorism is a must. That has been agreed by all. So we, to enlighten us and also to discuss all these issues, we have a very eminent panelists. We have Dr. Maheshwari, who is known to most of us here, who has been very active in this field. We have Mr. Munir from Bangladesh, research fellow. Mr. Prabhat, himself a very active in combating terrorism in the state of Andhra Pradesh, and also Mr. Rakimov. So we wish that we shall have a very interesting discussion ahead. I will request the panelists to restrict their speech into about 15 minutes or so, 16, so that we have more question and answers. Thank you. First, I will invite Mr. Prabhat. Will you be ready? Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me convey my gratitude to Mr. Ram Madhav and India Foundation for having me here. And secondly, I must also be grateful to my young friends from Jindal Law School who helped me in rustling up a presentation. Could you help me go back, please? Some problem with it? Was it switched off? Thank you. Let me inform you that I make no pretensions of being either a scholar or an academic. I'm just one of the boots on ground. Many years ago, many centuries ago, when in the sands of Arabia, a new religion was born. So it said, there is no one worthy of worship except Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. Unfortunately, over the last thousands of years, this has been interpreted by the radical elements to consider as if there's no other religion and no other God. These were the 5 pillars of Islam. That's how it was meant to be. And thereafter, we had Taymiyyah. Interestingly, he was a Sufi from an interesting Sufi sect. And he was the first one to talk about jihad as the 6th pillar. Then we had Wahhab, and all of us are aware of a great Saudi export besides oil, Wahhabi Islam. Then we had Hassan al-Banna, who formed what can be easily called as the fountainhead of all terrorist movements in the world as they exist today. Then we had Sayyid Qutb. He went to America, studied in a school which I think is now called as University of North Colorado. It's going on auto, please. And it's very interesting. The third point, ladies and gentlemen, he mentioned change must be sudden and violent. That definitely is not something which should be expected from a person who's educated and civilized. These are the various problems which have led to radicalization. We have Sharia and its interpretation. There are 2 features of Sharia that work together to create the conflict with Western democracies. The first is its emphasis that only Allah can righteously create laws that are binding on human beings. Devout Muslims describe this feature as a protection against tyranny, because it means that Allah forbids tyrants to impose new laws and obligations on the people, to include new taxes, but really laws of any kind. The emphasis on forbidding man-made laws means that the democratic process must be seen as fundamentally illegitimate. That is the most important part. We have a lot of speakers earlier in the day have been mentioning about, General Hasnan mentioned about homegrown terrorists, even though I'm supposed to be talking about counter-narratives. But before we actually get to the counter-narrative part, we need to understand what is the present narrative, what is all about. This is very interesting. It's not, in fact, this is the quintessence of the problem today. How they feel, not how they think. So it's more to do with the heart and less to do with the mind. We have the biggest problem today. Liberal democracies have not found any solution or any weapon to deal with the venom and the vitriol which is coming through internet. And to give you an anecdote from Kashmir, it's very interesting. Almost about 4 years ago, when J&K was due for, like the rest of the country, the general elections, during a discussion with a politician from a remote area of the valley, one came to learn that you must be aware that the last two namazs of the day are Maghrib, followed by Isha, the last one. Between Maghrib and Isha, the time lapse is fairly short, and in most places, whether in towns or even in villages, due to the reason that a person may not like to come back from home again for the fifth namaz, the final namaz of the day, they normally stay back in the masjid. And that is the time when most radicalization does take place. Developing a legalistic interpretation is the foundational step towards radicalism. And most importantly, trusting only certain extremely rabid Salafi jihadi scholars. And whenever you have any liberal voices of Islam around, they are stifled. They're called as people who are not conveying true Islam. We had Al-Qaeda, which was obviously pre-9/11 was OBL along with the Shura. Then after that, of course, we had decentralization in terrorism. Lone Wolf came in. We had AQ again getting centralized now. We have transnational crime and terror, deepening roots between the two, drug trafficking. The Afghan drugs. In fact, the greatest export from Afghanistan is heroin, and most of it is controlled by nobody else but the various terrorist groups. And how does a landlocked Afghanistan export its drugs? It's through the ISI, the Pakistan Army. They have a vested interest in keeping the pot boiling in Afghanistan, mainly because of their vested interest in drug trade or drug trafficking. We had oil and terror. At some point of time, OBL had declared oil as off limits. Thereafter, he considered it as the in thing. And then, of course, ISIS, right from beginning, wanted to capture oil. So coming back to the original problem in the Middle East, oil has continued for last many decades as a very, very important part of the puzzle which the Middle East is. As mentioned earlier, internet, social media, gradual shift to online networks. You have the various advantages, no space or time limits. You could be anywhere in the world. It could be any time zone. Importance of chat rooms. Most importantly, complete anonymity, complete invisibility. America is dealing with the crushing rise of jihadi dark web chatter that privatizes radicalization. When we say America, please read it as the rest of the civilized world as well. Yanks normally like to think it's only America which is affected by these problems. Indoctrination into a violent political ideology thrives through combination of secret portals and chat rooms like Amak on Telegram. I'll leave the rest. We had the evolution of global Islamic terror, which was the 1980s phase of Afghanistan, Pakistan. Thereafter, once Mujahideen phase ended, you had fairly well-educated people coming in, and the worst is today, the post-Iraq generation, the terrorist wannabes, and they are potentially, in fact, thousands would be incorrect, it could be potentially millions. And Arab Spring, which was supposed to be an awakening in the Middle East, led to completely contrary results. AQ goes down, ISIS goes up, ISIS goes down, AQ on the rise again. And in this entire habitat, which is extremely hostile for the enemy, but he's completely enabled by internet. And Europe, obviously, the French diplomat is here. Europe has a huge problem, large number of immigrants. Unfortunately, most of them in ghetto-like communities, as was also seen in Brussels. This is what Pakistan does to us. Understanding ideology, radicalization, emerging trends, evidence-based research, terrorism research. Now, this is the most important thing. We're talking about counter-radicalization. We're talking about counter-narratives or alternative narratives. But first, have we even tried to understand what is the enemy's narrative all about? We haven't, really. It's very interesting. As ISIS loses ground in Mosul, its leaders are scouring the Quran for ideas that justify the group's retreat. That was, of course, a long time back. This is by far the most important thing. Some speakers earlier in the day mentioned this. The most credible voices talking against extremist and radical Islam and terror have to come within each community. And when I mean each community, it doesn't mean somebody saying something in Pakistan would resonate in India. It has to be in each community across the globe. Even though Indonesia has been a remarkable example of bonhomie, the fact remains that of late, things are not so hunky-dory there as well. Islam to be a religion of war. Anyway, this is a little, can't read it. If you want your Islam to be a religion of war, you have an easy time of it. Just read the biography of the Prophet in the book of Jihad, in a standard legal handbook. If you want to be a Muslim pacifist, you have a harder time of it. Though you can maybe invoke the phase in Muhammad's career as a prophet before God gave him permission to fight. Anyway, there is no question that these people are drawing inspiration from Islamic texts. There is no doubt. And they know these texts better than most Muslims. The more radical you are, the more extremist you are. It's extremely, extremely easy to find texts to propagate your ideology and to denounce others. These were by far the most sensible words said by anyone in the recent times. This is the Iraqi Prime Minister. Muslims, Christians, Shia, Sunni, Kurds, Arabs, we are all on one side and they are on the other. There are two wars today, the war to stop ISIL and the war to end it. In Iraq, we are doing everything we can locally to win both wars. But ending ISIL and its ideology is a global responsibility. This is again very interesting. When ISIS first appeared in Afghanistan and managed to get a military footprint. So apparently, some people were actually pining for Taliban. Then we talk about de-radicalization, counter-radicalization. France wants to de-radicalize homegrown terrorists, but no one really knows how to do it. And that's the story all over the world, not only France. And coming back to the Muslim Brotherhood, they are still dominant. The jury is out as to why Saudi Arabia is after Al Jazeera and Qatar. But the fact remains, there must be something. This is the motto of the Brotherhood. Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, the Quran is our law, jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope. Now that is extremely, extremely petrifying. President Obama said something very interesting. Western countries should avoid dictating what clothes a Muslim woman should wear under the pretense of liberalism. What we were mentioning earlier, rather discussing, evidence frames what kinds of questions need to be asked and what research or analysis needs to be done. We need evidence. We need more think tanks, more institutions to delve into the nuances. Advice for Mujahideen when facing the enemy, multiple. And it makes the world look very scary. This is the view from the other side. We're all aware about Gitmo. This was a young man who went to Gitmo and came out after 12 years. This is very interesting. Successful counterterrorism strategies build social cohesion and consequently community resilience. Well-integrated people have the power to tear down the us versus them rhetoric and heal their communities and the alienated individuals within them. Now, obviously, living in the world in which we live today, the joint family system having crumbled down, nuclear families, and the anonymity of living in big cities, you may have a lone wolf staying right next to your apartment, flat, or house, and you would never be aware as to what he is doing. This is after what happened in Brussels, the mayors. This is the most important part. We're talking about radicalization or counter-radicalization. But the fact remains, we need to ensure that radicalization does not take place in the first place. And when we talk about counter-narratives and alternative narratives, we need to understand that the enemy, all these terrorist tanzeems, all these terrorist organizations, they have a complete stranglehold on the narrative. And we need to take this power away from them. The easiest would be if the world did not have liberal democracies. So like China, we could have tightened the internet. But unfortunately, liberal democracies are stuck with a problem. The problem in what is right, what is not, what is fair, and what's not. And unfortunately, this gives all the terrorist organizations that advantage, the advantage of being the first mover on the net. So we are always a couple of steps behind. We're only reacting like a fire brigade. We don't have any prevention happening. So videos, we saw a video today on counter-radicalization. But then, you see, one size does not fit all. Each country, each region, each community will need extremely in-depth counter-narrative or alternative narrative strategies. And this is very interesting. Everybody's working with stereotypes because nobody knows what one sign of radicalization actually looks like. I can understand somebody in Afghanistan or Pakistan or in Iraq getting radicalized. But what about somebody in East London? For God's sake, the London mayor is a Muslim, and that too of Pakistani descent. So what has pushed some East Londoners into Syria or made entities like Jihadi John? Closer home, we have things happening in Valley. Most importantly, when we talk about radicalization, we need to acknowledge the problem. Sometimes we don't. Then we have to address aspirations. There are many short-term measures which have to be launched. Most importantly, giving the youth icons. Baghdadi is not an icon. Osama is not an icon. We need to give people icons. Scientists, engineers, sportsmen. Long-term, this is very important. This, in fact, is a problem which I've seen happening in various places wherever one has worked. Engaging the community in a constant conversation. You may or may not like a person, an entity, or a thought, or a group of people because of the way they deal with the rest of the world. But we need to constantly converse. In Urdu, there's something which goes like this: Dil mile na mile, haath milate rehna chahiye. And we stop conversing with people. We need to converse, obviously, upgrading schools, making them secular schools more attractive is very important. I was astounded and dumbfounded. A very, very rich, well-to-do doctor couple from Hyderabad who are based in the United States. They send their kids back to Hyderabad and put them in a madrasa. Something is wrong with us. These are, warning signs as to how, even if a person is well-to-do and educated, things may not exactly be what they look on the surface. And encouraging credible voices within the community, yes. And most importantly, rather than saying a counter-narrative or changing the narrative, alternative narrative, we need to change the narrative. And aggressively. And we need not, feel shy about it. If Pakistan or various other entities like that have been playing around havoc with the entire world, and the reality is today, mankind has perhaps never seen a bigger and more potent danger than what exists today. We need to be upfront about it. We need to take them head on. And this is where the challenge, the last point is our biggest challenge. Beating the enemy at his own game, that is on internet. And this war, ladies and gentlemen, will be won or lost on the net. Every time we block a few sites, every time we put new narratives, he comes up with newer ones. He rapidly keeps on morphing. The technology which we use to get after him, he's 100 steps, if not 1,000 ahead of us. And what's the way forward? We need to do capacity building. We have these very stereotyped methods of working with problems. For example, in my state, in Andhra, for example, let's imagine there is some Islamic terror link. So now what do? You find some documents, maybe in Arabic or in Urdu. You'll catch hold of a subordinate, a junior colleague who would be knowing Urdu or Arabic. And obviously, as I said, stereotypes, he would be a Muslim. Those who are not Muslims have neither tried to learn the language nor tried to understand Islam as a religion. We need to do that capacity building. And once we do this capacity building, that is the only way we as a world will be able to combat political Islam. It's not the religious Islam which we have to fight. It's actually the political Islam which one has to think of. And somebody in the audience earlier in the day had asked the question. I totally agree. The king of Saudi Arabia, and presently, in the present context, perhaps the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, the family being the custodians of the two holiest shrines of Islam, they need to assume the leadership role and send an unequivocal, a very clear message to the world that this is not Islam. AQ, ISIS, Taliban, that's not Islam. Unfortunately, when and how the crown prince will be able to do it is something which is a matter of conjecture. Interestingly, of course, women can drive in Saudi Arabia now. So let's hope and pray that this too will happen one day. And besides, the old, centuries-old traditional conflict between various sects of Islam, that's another problem, which was mentioned as the rivalry. I think Miss Christine Fair was alluding to the rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia and how America decided to choose one over the other, etc., etc. The fact remains, the Shia Sunni schism, and of course, the Wahhabi Salafi attitude of looking at anybody who is of Sufi persuasion, or let's say Ahmadiyya, or some other lesser known sect of Islam as a complete heretic, that's another part of the problem. This is the narrative, ladies and gentlemen. I'm sure the academicians will be able to find the counter narrative. Thank you so much. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Mr. Prabhat. Having served with Mr. Prabhat in Srinagar, Jammu Kashmir, quite a few times, he almost poured his heart out. Thank you very much. And now I will request Mr. Safwat Munir. Mr. Munir is the head of the Bangladesh Center for the Terrorism Research Institute. So I'll request you to do the honors, and he's volunteered to speak from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much. At the outset, I would like to express my personal appreciation to the India Foundation for inviting me to be here today to speak at this August gathering, but also for organizing this great conference. Over the years, this initiative has really come a long way as a preeminent forum on counterterrorism in the Asia Pacific. I must say I'm particularly encouraged by many of the presentations today, including some of the very important words spoken by the previous speaker. And I would like to basically take up where he has left off. We are ultimately engaged in an ideological battle, and I think that is something that must be recognized at the outset. It is a battle between various ideas. One might argue it's two ideas, one might argue it's multiple ideas, but it's a battle of ideas. In Bangladesh, I have always said that the fight that we are currently fighting, the fight against terrorism and violent extremism in Bangladesh, we should not see it as a security crisis. We should not see it as a temporary security problem. We should see it as a crisis for the future of our country. And I think that is true for many countries and societies across Asia and across the world. I personally want to say that I personally prefer the term alternative narrative rather than counter-narrative. Because when we say counter-narrative, we are almost on the defensive, saying that the narrative presented by the violent extremists is the right narrative. At the moment, as Mr. Prabhat has rightly pointed out, they are trying to dominate the space with their narrative. And we should be in a position, we as in the whole counter-terrorism, countering violent extremism response community, should be in a place to present our narrative and essentially trump their narrative with the narrative that we have. And it is a very complex and onerous task to present that narrative. We have heard throughout the day how various narratives are presented. And I think one very important thing to remember is that in this fight, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Each country, each group, each society has a different narrative. I mean, if we look at India, I think various groups have various narratives. So the narratives need to be properly calibrated and presented so that they can actually attract the attention that we desire. In our region, many of our approaches are kinetic and more focused on operational counterterrorism. And there are some solid reasons behind it, because most of the time we are trying to contain the threat, we are trying to stop attacks from happening, we are trying to go after modules and so on. But I think the time has now come for us to think beyond the operational. While I do not for a moment try to suggest that operational counterterrorism measures are not necessary, we in Bangladesh know very well how necessary it is to have relentless operational counterterrorism measures. But in tandem, we must also look at strategic measures. And when I say strategic measures, I think constructing the appropriate narrative is something that we have to emphasize a lot. I also want to say that a group doesn't need to be proscribed or a banned terrorist organization in order to be dangerous and lethal. And in this context, I want to take the example of Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a group banned in Bangladesh but legal in many other countries, but does not necessarily engage in terrorist acts or does not really go and explode bombs and so on per se. But when we unpack their narrative, and at my center within the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security Studies, we are constantly analyzing jihadist and Islamist narrative. When we unpack the narrative of groups such as Hizb ut-Tahrir, the danger that they pose to security of the state, the danger that they pose to the region, and more specifically, I would say the danger that they pose to the future of relations between India and Bangladesh is significant. Although it is a group which is not directly engaging in terrorism, but they have the ability to spread their narrative, primarily through cyberspace, but also through other means, and have the same kind of effect. So when we talk about constructing counter-narratives, we must keep in mind that we are not only talking about the narratives of terrorist groups per se, but we also need to address the narrative of organizations which are not necessarily terrorist, but extremist in nature. There is a constant debate that whether people get attracted to terrorism for ideological reasons or whether people get attracted to terrorism for pecuniary privations or other reasons. I think when we look at the case of South Asia, for instance, we see both examples. There are cases in India, Bangladesh, and many other places where people have been attracted to militancy for lack of opportunities and various other reasons. But there are also enough examples before us of individuals actually taking up terrorism for purely ideological reasons. In the case of Bangladesh, and I would be referring back to Bangladesh throughout my remarks, because there are several examples which are quite pertinent to what we are talking about. We now see militants coming from educated, affluent backgrounds as well. And it has led to many counterterrorism analysts in Bangladesh and elsewhere question that does it really tally with the narrative that we have known so far, that if you are a militant, you are from a particular education system, you are from a particular social strata. But when we had the attack on Holy Artisan Bakery in July 2016, the perpetrators, most of them, came from a very different background altogether. So I think it requires for very serious introspection on our part that what is the narrative that is being sent out to these people? I think we were quite premature, or we are quite premature in our celebration that we have defeated Daesh. Daesh or ISIS might have been militarily degraded, weakened, but the ideology they espouse, their ability to influence the human terrain, that has not really gone away. So while Daesh may be cornered, while Daesh may take a long time to present the kind of challenge that it presented militarily earlier, ideologically it still remains active and thriving, and we will have a long struggle ahead of us to counter this ideology. I was particularly very encouraged by the remarks by Chishti Saab this morning, and also the video that he showed us later. And I was reflecting on the syncretic Sufi traditions that we have had in South Asia. And it led me to question whether we have done enough across the region to actually harness it. The kind of message of peace, harmony, and peaceful cohabitation that Chishti Saab talked about, or the messages that these shrines send out, or these communities can create, is quite significant. And I think we need to better integrate theologians, preachers, Gaddi Nasheens like Chishti Saab into the whole process. And I'm particularly appreciative of the fact that he was here today with us and he presented his thoughts, because I think it is very important for individuals like him and organizations like his to be a part of the whole discourse. The jihadists and the militants like everyone to believe that it's the world versus Islam, and that is exactly not the case. The truth is very different from that, and I think it is important for the moderate voices in Islam, and as a Muslim I feel very strongly about it, that I think the moderate voices of Islam must come forward and take the lead. For too long it has been a case of the silent majority, and the time has come that we need to speak out very forcefully that the violence being perpetrated by misusing the name of the religion, by misrepresenting the thoughts of the religion, is something that needs to stop. And I think their theologians and the people who are steeped in Sufi traditions and the traditions that we have in our region can be very important and very useful. We have a long tradition of harmony and syncretism in South Asia. We have a long tradition where different faiths have commingled, where they have borrowed from each other, where they have celebrated each other's festivals and so on. There is a very important need for us to harness some of these ideas and present it to the new generation. The jihadists never let us forget about some of the episodes in the history of the Indian subcontinent, which are full of violence and disharmony between communities. But I think the question is, are we, from the response community's perspective, doing enough to reinforce messages of harmony or present from our history episodes of harmonious coexistence? I don't think we are. And that is something we also need to address. There is also a need to understand and acknowledge that there is a governance deficit and there is a deficit of service delivery in our region. We see that in Bangladesh, we see that in other parts of the region as well. And the deficit of good governance, the deficit of service delivery often creates an environment which extremists and militants exploit and try to use that to espouse their ideology. So we must constantly remain on guard how we can improve our good governance structures, how we can improve rule of law, how we can create more just societies so that we can present a counter to the militants and jihadists and tell them that the society that they're espousing to create is not in any way better than the society that we currently have. There's a militant group in Bangladesh called Jamaatul Mujahideen Bangladesh, and I've spent a greater part of my career studying that group. And they use a particular ideology called Taghut. Taghut, essentially, very loosely translated, means satanic, and they try to say that the Bangladeshi state and society, in many ways, in their minds, is a representation of the evil. And therefore, violence is a moral imperative to reform this society. But there is an opportunity for us to present to the audience and say that how malicious and wrong that argument is. And within our societies, if we take the example of Bangladeshi society, there are so many good things to look into historically and even now and say that the argument that they're presenting is completely wrong. We are also seeing increasing amount of narrative about trying to stoke communal tensions, also trying to create discord between countries created by jihadists. In the case of Bangladesh, we're increasingly seeing a proliferation of anti-India rhetoric in many of the jihadist narrative, and that can have very deleterious and negative consequences in the long run. So there is an opportunity for both our countries to work together. We're already doing a tremendous amount in terms of counterterrorism cooperation. In fact, I would say the bilateral counterterrorism cooperation between our two countries is a model of success. But there is perhaps an opportunity for our think tanks, our civil societies, our analytical communities to work together to craft a proper alternative narrative to counter the narrative presented by these groups. There is also the element of the diaspora connection. Increasingly, we are seeing while individuals are not getting engaged in these activities when they're at home, but when they're going abroad for various reasons, they're getting engaged in activities related to militancy and extremism. So that is an angle which we need to analyze, and there are potentially lessons that can be useful for both our countries. We also have a serious problem across the region. Bangladesh has already been facing it, but other countries are facing it too, of radicalization among returned migrant workers. And we all know that a significant population from our region live and work in countries in the Gulf, where a section of them have been exposed to various ideas. And when they have come back, they have tried to impose those ideas on others. For the paucity of time, we can't go into case studies, but there are many case studies as such. So there is an opportunity to do more research on this subject. There's an opportunity to see what are some of those drivers and how we can address it. Throughout the day, we have been talking about the cyber domain, and I would say that the cyber domain can be a very important tool. We have two options. We can either see cyberspace as a problem, we can either see social media as a problem and find ways of shutting it down or curtailing access, or we can be proactive and use that domain to spread our message the same way the militants and extremists are doing. And I think the overwhelming consensus would be that we should go for the latter rather than the former. There is a clear opportunity for us to spread our narrative through cyberspace. Contrary to what many studies show, and most of the internet use studies are based on broadband penetration, but if we bring in the element of the smartphone, the penetration of cyberspace or internet user population in South Asia is a staggering number. For example, in the case of Bangladesh, Dhaka, our capital Dhaka, has emerged as the second largest population of Facebook users as a city after Bangkok. So there is a staggering number of people now accessing the internet thanks to the smartphone. Many mobile operators in Bangladesh provide free internet and free Facebook access to their users, particularly in the rural areas. So we should definitely make use of cyberspace to further spread and take forward our message. But the message has to be coherent. Mr. Prabhat has pointed out some examples. I think discoherent messaging can sometimes create more problems than solving them. It is also important to know who's the messenger. Governments will have to take the lead, but at times, given how argumentative and cynical we are in South Asia, when a government sends out a message, we try to take it with a pinch of salt. So perhaps there is an opportunity for us to have more public-private partnerships in crafting narratives and then pushing it out. I think at the end of the day, a very important point we must recognize is that the people that we are up against, the individuals and organizations we are up against, they're working 24/7. They're extremely motivated in the ideology that they believe in, and they're working all the time to prove that they're right. In our zeal, or in our effort to present our case and present the right case, which I would call the right case and the right narrative, we have to match that zeal, we have to match that enthusiasm, and we have to match that motivation. It is not a case of stopping one terrorist attack from happening. It is not a case of stopping one mass casualty attack from happening, or it is not a case of disrupting a module or killing a group of militants. It is a case eventually of what kind of societies we will have down the line. It is a case of a question of stability. I think the Honorable Commerce Minister earlier made a very important point that how international trade, aviation, and other sectors are also adversely affected by terrorism. Terrorism is a phenomenon which touches upon various facets of society. In the case of Bangladesh, we have seen how after one particular attack, our economy, our overall stability, the city that we live in, Dhaka, was affected. But we have also seen a positive thing, that how the society was able to bounce back within a very short span of time. We have seen the same level of resilience displayed by the brave people of Mumbai after the Mumbai attacks, and how quickly the city bounced back. It is not all gloom and doom. There are also important initiatives happening in our societies. There are indigenous examples within India and Bangladesh of societies fighting back, people presenting narratives, trying to come together, the youth coming together to create youth platforms to come up with an alternative narrative. Those examples are also there. What we really need is to network and harness all our resources together and engage in a common fight. It is not a fight for Bangladesh, it is not a fight for India, it's not a fight for Nepal, it's not a fight for Sri Lanka. It's a fight for our whole region. And as our militant groups have displayed an extraordinary zeal and enthusiasm to cooperate with each other, as states, we must find a way to cooperate with each other as well. In Bangladesh, we have seen very practically, and I have discussed with many individuals present in this room personally as well, we have seen in Bangladesh how robust counterterrorism and security cooperation with our close neighbor India, what kind of benefits it has yielded for us. And I think when we look at the history of this cooperation, maybe decades from now, we will look back with a lot of appreciation and satisfaction that how this cooperation has really helped both our countries. So I think there are opportunities for deepening such bilateral cooperation, but also to take the cooperation at a regional and multilateral level. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about constructing and crafting counter-narratives or alternative narratives, it cannot be done by one country alone. The theological communities in our two countries and our region need to come together. They also need to rise up. There is an opportunity for creating better harmony between faith-based communities and different communities. There is an opportunity to do more research on historical examples where we can present cases of harmony. And as a think tanker, I will be very remiss if I don't emphasize the point about more evidence-based research, more policy-based research, and more interface between policy community and the analytical community to come up with the right answer. And in the end, the ultimate weapon is in all our midst, but we sometimes don't see it. Farid Zakaria had once said that the ultimate counterterrorism tool is social resilience. If we are not terrorized, they do not win. So I would like to stop by saying that social resilience is the ultimate weapon. We have to bolster social resilience. We have to harness our strengths together. We are engaged in a long war, but ultimately victory will be ours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Munir. And I would like to mention two of your takeaways from your speech was about the defensive nature of the counter narrative should be altered. That is something that is very interesting. The second part is, of course, the spiritual and theological dimension, which you mentioned, which Isab in the morning had mentioned about. Thank you very much for your... The next speaker would be Dr. Maheshwari, sir. And we look forward to hearing from you because you are in it already in a very great catch.
I am delighted to be the part of deliberations. I don't know how far my ideas will be good, but I'm confident of this bouquet of intellectuals. And this is the beauty of intellectual gathering, that they provide a space to all type of thoughts. And with that humble confidence, I would like to present my views. In human existence, we have already found the history is an example that the dominant players try to set the trend the way they want the things. In the history, we have seen that religion has been used by the political masters as a tool to control the masses. In the recent history, we have seen those countries who have been dominant. They have tried to control the other countries, and wherever the military victory has not been converted into civic victory, lots of problems have arisen. It means we have to diagnose the problem first, how to control the masses, why these things are arising the way they are arising. There must be reasons for it, and that indicates that where are the root cause and what are we doing. There must be a single man once upon a time, must be physically very strong, built, he must be controlling things. Then there must be a group of people, there must be tribes who must be controlling, creating terror. Then there were kingdoms who had better weapons, as you see in the history. They must have ruled. Then there came the market economy, balance of power to balance of payment. The countries try to rule, dominate in various ways. And today we have reached to the era where information is controlling the roost. We are past the eras where geographies were important, then the humanitarians became important, and now the cybertarians become important. But the most important change is that everything has now become invisible. When we come to the cyberterrain, the wars which were there now are being seen in terms of the proxy war. Even the enemies are invisible. So we are entering the era of invisible war. That is what they call the 4G. And to quote the very popular survey which often says that even see the last 2 wars, and the 37 countries were affected, they devastated. About 9 countries because of the aggression, and remaining 28 countries because of the lack of internal security. There were fault lines in the internal security. The problems will remain as they are, but we have to build the capacities, we have to build the resistance that we can survive through. Now, this proxy war situation which has taken shape, the problem of invisible enemy, the civil society becomes important. When the civil society becomes important, then something is to be done by the intellectual society. Now, we don't need more warriors with guns. We need more warriors with intellectuals. Now, the scholarly warriors are needed. You all are part of that set. Now, the civic society has to take lead. And all those agencies which are related to the civic society, I come from a police organization, so I will even plead that even the policing systems have to be strengthened because they are the first responders, even in the proxy war situations. So we have to look beyond certain things. The intellectual society has to play with the mind because we go to the virtual world, those invisible enemies where the people are playing with the mind, the responses have to be organized accordingly. The risk is not that somebody has the weapons. The risk is not that somebody has got a very different way of thinking, the radicalized way of thinking. This has been happening in every society. Even in the Indian society, we have seen the cases where the higher caste used to attack the lower caste in places like Bihar, UP, and they were all terrorized. They were also undergoing the same mental pressure. And this radicalization was there to the extent that in one of the states, a judgment was passed based on the presumption that a particular caste cannot do wrong to another caste because of the physical touchability. And this is the civic society came on the road, and civic society changed the whole situation. That is the power of this civil society. And therefore today, if any narrative is to be built, as my predecessor, the earlier speakers have also spoken in their own way, the world over, the civic society has to come together, and we have to have the scholarly warriors now on the virtual world, because that is controlling the mind. And the most important thing, the only weapon which is potent, which God has made, and very complicated and very potent, is the mind. And that needs to be controlled and handled. That is what my submission will be. Therefore, the grassroots response is important. Therefore, when we say, like in a land, we say that the weeds will anyway grow, the wild growth will be there. You sow the good seeds, so that they take over. That hypothesis is good, even for individual, for the society, in any country, or even at the global community level. And therefore, all intellectuals don't expect that the wild grass or the weeds will not grow. They will grow. But the intellectual society, the civic society has to sow the seeds. We have to make the land infertile for any terrorist seed which can come. We increase our own internal resistance. As I said, we have to be inclusive. We cannot be, as an intellectual, a responsible citizen, talking we and they. No. It has to be an inclusive society. And when we talk about that, again I take two dictums. One is that the solution of a problem lies in the womb of the problem. I repeat, the solution of any problem lies in the womb of the problem. And when my friend from this dais said that there have been examples of Sufism, there had been examples of the preachers, the intellectuals in that society, probably the civic society globally has to take an inclusive view of the intellectuals in a particular segment, and the right type of thought has to be generated. Another, I borrow from one of the anecdotes of Akbar and Birbal. Akbar was known for his good administration, and he had very good advisors. Birbal was one of his advisors, and he calls him and says, here is a line. Can you reduce its size without touching it? Akbar took a pencil and drew a bigger line side by side without touching the earlier line. So there may be problems in life. We may not be able to touch it, but then we can relatively reduce its dominance by drawing a bigger line. And therefore, those bigger lines, as has been enumerated, by inclusive existence, by all the intellectuals being together, by collaboration, starting with, we may not look for any single global narrative. An alternate narrative cannot be global. It may be from a particular society, it may be from a country, then we go to the bilateral collaboration, then we go for the regional collaboration. That is how one will have to grow. So that is the submission in short from my side. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Dr. Maheshwari, for the incisive talk on that. And if I have to mention one takeaway from what he said, is that actually terrorist masterminds are also entrepreneurs. They're also good at literature and all this artistic manner. And our story has to have a better story than his. That is the takeaway that I learned. That is that you said that drawing a line bigger than the other one. Thank you very much, sir. Now we have our last speaker, Mr. Ashraf Hydari. Mr. Hydari is the Director General of the Policy in the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of Afghanistan.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to participate and discuss the importance of regional counterterrorism and counter-narcotics cooperation, which of course entails countering terrorist narratives. My special thanks to the India Foundation and especially to Director Ram Madhav, a great friend of Afghanistan, and his tireless team for organizing this very productive conference. Also, I would like to take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to the government and people of India for continued development and civilization support. And this connection, I would like to acknowledge the presence of India's former ambassador and a good friend of Afghanistan, Ambassador Amir Sana, who did so much to help build and deepen ties between our two nations, for which we remain grateful. And I'd like to discuss 3 points which His Excellency National Security Advisor Anif Atmar discussed at the recent Kabul process meeting for peace and security cooperation. This meeting was attended by over 30 countries, including India and international organizations. They constitute the principal stakeholders in the Afghan peace process, and as well as in efforts to help stabilize Afghanistan as we jointly fight terrorism. First, a joint assessment and common understanding of the threat, and to dispel myths, some of which were discussed yesterday and today, and then the need for mutually reinforcing strategies to counter and defeat the threats, and as well as the need for regional coordinated peace and counterterrorism efforts, for which we made 7 proposals in the last meeting of the Kabul process for international and as well as regional cooperation and support. First, in the Afghan context, we understand and consider terrorism as a threat to national security interests, state security, and as well as economic interests. And we know that this is a threat not limited to Afghanistan, but to every country in the region, including Pakistan, and as well as the broader international community. And this threat, in our context, emanates from a lethal nexus of violent extremism by transnational terrorist networks, criminal economics by transnational criminal networks, and as well as covert state sponsorship. In the principal drivers of terrorism in the Afghan context include the Afghan insurgent networks, the Taliban and the Haqqani network, which provide an enabling environment, serve as an umbrella platform under which transnational terrorist networks have come together to destabilize Afghanistan, the region, and the world at large. And these include Al-Qaeda, Daesh, ISK, LET, TTP, IMU, or Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, and ETM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement. And, of course, transnational criminal networks, which include traffickers of drugs, humans, weapons, precursors. And the 3 have a symbiotic reinforcing relationship. If you consider the relationship among transnational terrorist networks, and then that between TTN and TCN, involving protection, sanctuaries, logistics, financing, and training, which were discussed yesterday and today, and I don't want to go into details. Unfortunately, from where we stand in the Afghan context and our surrounding region, this problem has only grown. The number of terrorists and transnational criminal networks and their capabilities have grown, and unfortunately it's increasingly centered in Afghanistan. And that's why we need to look at the situation based on facts, not so many myths that are propagated by state and non-state actors. In our context, the fact that the war in Afghanistan is not a civil war, it's global terrorism, as a state sponsorship of terrorism, which of course was discussed in the last session, doesn't need any further clarification, and as well as organized crime, which then uses such an environment to drive the mass drug cultivation and production to meet the regional and global demand. If you think about how much drugs produced in Afghanistan costs, is, estimates range from $60 billion to $350 billion. So in a sense, we are fighting with very scarce resources, let's say 60 to $350 billion illicit business, and that's why it's so challenging. Again, it was pointed out by panelists, let's really not associate Islam with terrorism. Of course, 99% of Afghans are Muslims, and yet we are the victims, and yet we are the fighters against this threat. And of course, have made the largest number of sacrifices, not Americans, not Indians, or Chinese, or others, but of course Muslims themselves. We lost 10,000 Afghans last year, 10,000 just last year. If you look at the United Nations report, especially UNAMA's report, these include women, children, and so forth. And we also, Muslim countries, in this case Afghanistan, is effectively partnering with countries in the region and beyond to fight this. And so, no association. Islam is a religion of peace, tolerance, and coexistence. And no country has really exemplified that than India. And if you really look at the history of Sufism in this context, which was, of course, discussed this morning by Chishti Sharif, which is in Herat of Afghanistan, how Chishti Sharif migrated from Afghanistan, Western Afghanistan, to come to India with a message of peace, with a message of bringing different castes into equality, into harmony, into peace. And that's the message that we in this region, in South Asia, must use to fight extremism and terrorism. And of course, there should be no distinction between good and bad terrorism, as Pakistan makes, and I think it's already hurting them. Remember, a few years ago, there was no TTP, the Taliban of Pakistan. The fact that emerged because of this distinction, that we fight good Taliban, bad Taliban, we don't fight good Taliban, which they consider as their proxy in the Afghan context. And again, the fact that Afghanistan is really not just defending ourselves, but defending this region, defending India, defending Central Asia, by extension China and Russia and Europe and the rest in this global war against terrorism. My second point, therefore, is a need for mutually reinforcing strategies. And we discussed this in the recent Kabul process meeting, that on the one hand, we must pursue a peace strategy to separate the Taliban from transnational terrorist networks. And if they're denied sanctuaries in our immediate neighborhood, then we should be able to make a significant contribution to regional and global counterterrorism efforts. And at the same time, we should pursue a counterterrorism and counter-narcotics strategy, which, of course, should advance our peace efforts by increasing the number of reconcilable Taliban, because that would effectively pressure them into peace talks with us. And this too would bolster and contribute to regional and global counterterrorism campaign. And this brings me to the third point as a result for a need for regional coordinated peace and counterterrorism efforts, so long as such threats, such common threats, require common strategy. And under this, we made 7 specific proposals, because oftentimes we get together in meetings and regional and global conference to discuss the threat, but no one really puts forward action plans, strategies, how to actually move forward and address the problem, as opposed to just talking about it and then forgetting about it. In Afghanistan, this time, we put forth two strategies, one for peace, and of course, which President Ghani made a comprehensive peace offer to the Taliban so that they come forward and talk peace to address the problem through a long-term sustainable political settlement, and as well as, of course, a counter-narcotics and counter-terrorism strategy. And of course, we propose that we should hold a regional conference to agree on such strategies and coordination. Under our obligations, existing obligations, and under existing mechanisms of cooperation, and we're not short of those. Under any mechanism that you see, from SARC to Shanghai Organization cooperation to, of course, United Nations global counterterrorism, which has an elaborate definition and, of course, the steps that we need to take to fight. Second, at the same time, an action plan that we need to adopt for implementation with our Islamic partners, especially Saudi-led Islamic military coalition in the fight against terrorism, through which we must share intelligence to deal with foreign fighters in Afghanistan, and as well as action against financing and counter-terrorist ideology, and as well as support for the Afghan national security forces, including our army and police. At the same time, we'd like to sign bilateral counterterrorism and counter-narcotics agreements with all of our neighbors, besides a regional approach, and as well as negotiating extradition agreements for prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration of foreign fighters and their families arrested in Afghanistan. We have already extradited 87 terrorists to 5 countries, and we're in the process of extraditing another 73 foreign fighters, terrorists, to 4 other countries. As most of those countries, I think all of them were present in the recent Kabul process meeting. We have also proposed a joint review of foreign fighters to trace the movement, their movement, and to identify their support infrastructure as a response. Because we're hearing allegations of how some of our partners are facilitating the expansion of Daesh's threat in Afghanistan, or the movement from one region to another, which we utterly reject. And that's why in this meeting, the NSA offered a joint review to some countries which allege that such issues are going on in Afghanistan. And as well as a joint review of terrorist financing. And lastly, we recently appreciated the initiative by the Indonesian government to invite scholars from Afghanistan and Pakistan to get together and meet in Indonesia later this month to organize a process of public education and issue fatwas to reject the hate ideology of terrorists, and as well as their terror campaign in Afghanistan. So with that, I keep it short, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you so much.
Now the house is open. I think the first hand I see is the director himself.
My question is to Shafkat, who talked that we should talk of alternative narratives and not counter-narrative. Because there seems to be an attempt to give a glancing blow rather than take the bull by its horn. And if we see, there is a problem, because since morning there have been a number of speakers who have reiterated there is no ideological challenge. Because globally, when we look, there are societies where religion as an institution is weakened, where people believe that there is no ideological challenge, there are other issues which are actually driving the terrorism. Whereas any radical ideology has lesser tolerance for ambiguity, and even if you deviate a bit, you will be castigated. But you will not be able to get the desired result. Because we have a lot of organizations which propound moderate views or countering radical ideologies. Minhajul Quran, for instance. Tahirul Qadri, I spoke to him. And when I talked to him about end of time battle, Khorasan and Ghazwa-e-Hind, he did not counter those hadiths. He only said that these Al-Qaeda and ISIS do not represent the true believers, and this is not the time. So that is there. And why I am saying is because in 827 AD, Al-Mamun, the Abbasid Caliph, had proclaimed that the Holy Quran is created and not revealed. And from 833 onwards, he continued with Mihna, whereby he went against the basic principle, and it prevailed all over the Islamic world. So if we are not going to take a real counter narrative, I'm not trying to say that this should be the narrative, but the counter narrative has to counter the narrative that is being put across by Al-Qaeda and ISIS, not an alternative narrative, because that will not lead you anywhere. You may create an alternate narrative, but the people will follow what they believe in.
I think you can. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. As always, I'm always marvel at your knowledge about Islamic history and your ability to bring some of those examples to bear. I think your point is absolutely valid. Quite often, we do not understand what the narrative is to begin with. I was recently talking to some police officials in Bangladesh and who are debriefing or talking to militants, and they were saying that sometimes the narrative that is given to these militants are so powerful that when you try to go and reason with them, they say that, no, this is what we have heard in the narrative. And there is also an element of risk where they are more attracted to the narrative rather than listening to your viewpoint. So crafting this counter-narrative, alternative narrative, whichever way we want to call it, is quite a tricky business, and it requires a tremendous amount of knowledge and nuance. Quite often what we think is that we look for simplistic solutions, that okay, we would give a statement and then maybe after that we will publish some papers or present some arguments and then the narrative would go away. It's not that simple. The narrative that these jihadist groups have presented to people, for instance, Ghazwa-e-Hind, which is a term even Bangladeshi groups are now increasingly latching onto, which is absolutely alarming and dangerous. There needs to be more research, there needs to be more analysis on how we can come up with a counter to this narrative. Because we are not really talking about episodes in history, as I mentioned, but our opponents are cherry-picking episodes of history and using it to their advantage. So I think there needs to be greater research on narrative. We also need to incorporate our historians and see how historical examples can be harnessed to our advantage. But I agree with you, it's a long struggle ahead.
Yeah, please give out your name and yes.
In any narrative that is being generated or a counter narrative, which is also another narrative, there is a process of generation which people talked about. There is a carrier which people talk about. There is an amount of absorption of the narrative that is being pushed that people reflect on. But what is the cyclic process by which you keep on improving the narrative that you are giving, or a feedback mechanism of pulling out what is the impact of the narrative that is being generated? Why are we a little hesitant about structuring the whole narrative process so that you can have a cyclical improvement over what is being generated?
Thank you. It's a very important and interesting question you have raised. I think to begin with, as I stated earlier, we're still scratching the surface when it comes to the battle of narratives. For too long, we have been focused on operational and tactical measures, and we have not really paid enough attention to actually fighting the ideological battle. I would again re-emphasize on the point that ideology is a very important component. An individual does not go away and get ready to put his entire life on the line and die in the process for money and other reasons. I mean, those motivations might be there, but ideology is a significant component which we must recognize. I think your point about creating a feedback loop, creating a process by which we can test the narrative is very important, and that is exactly what we are suggesting from the analytical community in the context of our country, but in the context of other countries as well. That once a narrative is designed, there must be a multi-platform strategic communication plan to actually populate that narrative. And once that narrative has been populated, there must be a way to test and get feedback and improve the narrative. We publish one book and then we forget about it for 2 years. It doesn't make any sense. Because again, I would come back to the point, I mean, you have to appreciate and estimate the strength of the enemy. And in this case, our enemy is engaged in this battle day in and day out. And they are constantly sharpening their narrative. If we do a historical study on jihadist narrative since 9/11, every year the narrative has been improved and sharpened, and they've come up with new arguments. So I think the onus is on us that we must be able to create a narrative which will not be out of date in 6 months, but something that will be relevant years from now. Thank you.
We are running short of time, so we'll have the last question from the girl there. She has been standing for quite some time. Yeah.
Good evening. Good evening. My question is for Mr. Nalin Prabhat. And you were talking about combating political Islam and not focusing much on the religious aspect of Islam. And I beg to differ from there and want to know that why do you say that we don't need to focus on religion? Because in my understanding, as I'm doing PhD on religious discourses, I feel that religious discourses has the root cause comes from there. And if we tap on that, then only maybe we can counter terrorism. And it's like a vicious circle in my understanding that political Islam and religion goes round and round. So why do you say that only combating political Islam is should be the focus for us? Thank you.
Well, ma'am, what you are saying, obviously you're an academic. You're far more experienced in these nuances. But let me tell you, as somebody who's worked on the ground, I've come across people with extremely, how should I say, very, very outwardly radical-looking signs. For example, long beard, no mustache, wearing shalwar kameez. Sometimes the shalwar is fairly high. But that does not mean that these people are actually Wahhabi. Or they are completely, how should I say, Islamists in their attitude. Or worse, supporters of Lashkar or AQ or Jaish or Hizbullah or whatever. But the fact remains is, political Islam is a different version. Political Islam is talking about, the entire ummah. Political Islam is talking about territories. Political Islam is talking about the green crescent flag flying all over the world. So that is where the problem is. You see, the moment an entity called ISIS was born, ISIS, unlike any other previous terrorist organization, was the first one which had territorial ambitions. And for any political entity, territory comes the first. And I'm sure, because you're doing PhD, you're far more educated about it, but I just mention as somebody who's worked on the ground, as purely as somebody who has seen firsthand bad areas, situations, and interacted with people in thousands, if not more. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I thank all the esteemed speaker and chair of this session for their very insightful and thought-provoking addresses and charting out a broad framework for constructing effective counter-narratives. May I now request the chair of this session, Lieutenant General K. Himala Singh, to felicitate the speakers. First to Mr. Nalin Prabhat. to Mr. Shafqat Munir. To Dr. Aap Maheshwari. To Mr. M. Ashraf Haidri. May I now request Ambassador Amar Sinha to felicitate the chair of this session, Lieutenant General K. Himalaya Singh. Thank you, sir. An important announcement. We will now break for 45 minutes. We will reconvene in this same hall at 7 p.m. for the special dinner address. Srimati Nirmala Sitharaman, Honorable Raksha Mantri, the Defense Minister, Government of India, and also the Director, India Foundation, and Mr. Kiran Rijiju, Honorable Minister of State for Home Affairs, Government of India, will deliver the special dinner address. So request you all to please be here at 7 p.m. Thank you.